let's do disclaimers, because boy, I need them on this. So first of all, this is a best effort. What I mean by this is, first of all, obviously, I am not the one who has gone and done these archaeological digs. I know that's going to come as a great shock to everybody. I have not dug these places out, done the deep dive research, so I'm aggregating this information from various sources that are available. They all seemed fairly reliable, and locations, in my opinion, are a best effort. Generally speaking, we may not know the specific exact city location, but probably the region is very accurate. I think that's the best way to understand this. Or in other words, we definitely know that it maybe could have been here. That'll be a bit more clear as we go along. But also, think about in your lifetime how much you've seen a city change in 40 years. A little bit different than it was 40 years ago. Now we're talking 4,000 years. Some things do change a little bit in that time. The other thing that I think is significant to understand in some of these, not only for this, but for historical records, why archaeology is what it is to understand that Abraham through Joshua, the people we're talking about, live in tents. They're not in a developed city as we would understand it now. They're not living in a house down the road over there. The example I thought of was Brother Mark doing the Appalachian Trail. Now, if you went out on the Appalachian Trail and looked for an archaeological footprint that he was ever there, would you find it? Because he was transient. He was moving through. I don't know if he signed a guest book anywhere. We guess he probably did. But other than that, you'd be hard-pressed to find much in the way of records that he was there. So when Abraham is moving around in tents and traveling these great areas, he's not leaving a huge footprint in one place. So the primary records are going to be the Bible because it's the actual written history of these things. And just going out to a campground somewhere, there's not going to be much evidence you were there. So that is one of the reasons these places can be difficult to find, is because cities then are not what cities were now. And a footnote on that is realize that we've got about 6,000 years of recorded history. And for less than 1% of that time, cities have been demographically negative, which means less people would be born in a city than would pass away in a city. So the population of cities existed from people moving into it. And that also means that for, again, 99% of history, you're talking about most people not living in cities. So that's one of the reasons these things can not always be the most obvious to find.
Yeah, one of the markers that you can use is they dug wells and named them after whatever, and that's basically the only permanent one that I can think of is something that was done as they moved around with their flocks and herds and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. There's a couple of them we're going to be able to see as we go along. The wells are a big one, but there's a great example. I don't want to get too far ahead, but water is key for where people live. It still is to this day. Now, we have an abundant source of water just over there that's easy to get to, but it's also not drinking water for that matter. But it could water crops. It could do things like that. So just realize water is key. And speaking of water being key, final footnote is the flood changes everything. I am not going to attempt to tell you where anything was before the flood. I think that's a silly little exercise for anybody to engage in. Okay, if you want to. But the face of the world changed tremendously by the flood, and I just don't think there's any reason to pick up before that. All right, that's my disclaimers. So, our first map is all wet. You can't see cities, you can't see where the ark was because the ark was on water. That is our starting point. So we begin with Genesis 9. I'm going to try and put Scripture up first, then understand the maps and give us a little context of what we're looking at and talking about. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." Now skipping ahead to verse 10, let me say, verse 9 is here. This is after the flood, obviously, and this is God's commandment to fill the earth. Don't miss those words because it's very important to what's coming up, the first place we're going to look at. But for people we're going to look at, Canaan is the son of Ham. Ham is the son of Noah. This is Noah's grandson. This is also the one that Noah gives a curse upon. I'm not going to go too far into that. You can look into that story if you want to, but understand Canaan to Noah is not a good relationship. Okay, so Canaan, also the Canaanites, this is the descendants that the Israelites are going to be contending with when they get to the Promised Land. So who are they? Sidon was his firstborn, and the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Arkites, Sinanites, Avarites, Zemanites, and Hamathanites are all definitely possible pronunciations, but I'm almost certainly wrong. That's okay as long as we understand who we're talking about. Later, the Canaanites' clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon towards Gerar as far as Gaza, and then towards Sodom, Gomorrah, and Adam, Zebulun, and as far as Lasha. All right. All that said, here's where we can start to make some sense of that. This is how the tribes are filling out. This is color-coded to Noah's sons. So in purple, we have the sons of Shem. Shem is the oldest. He's the firstborn. He's the one of inheritance. That's the line of Jesus, is through Shem. Ham is the father of the Canaanites. The Canaanites are over here. They're also filling out the Arabian area, the northern Africa area. And then you have Japheth, and his descendants are kind of filling out, going on towards Europe. So what you see here is two of the sons, their descendants, are spreading. One of the sons, they're not. They're staying clustered together. They're staying near each other. What was God's commandment? Fill the earth. It's interesting. That takes us to the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel does not say it was specifically an effort led by Nimrod. Nimrod is one of the people who's named in the genealogies in Genesis. But he is a descendant of Ham. He is the founder of Babylon. The Tower of Babel was near Babylon. So the best guess they have is that it's in this area. That is not where the modern capital of Iraq is, but it is a city that is definitely there. But what actually is this tower? What are they doing? And remember, the Canaanites are not scattering, they're staying together. Cush begot Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And beginning his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, Caleb in the land of Shinar. So, I thought for an interesting comparison, where are they building the Tower of Babel? This kind of gives you the elevation of the area. They seem to be doing it near the rivers. So it is one of the lower elevations, or about 0.62 miles above I can talk, I promise. About 0.62 miles above sea level. But a very interesting contrast was that Sarasota is 16 feet above sea level, or 0.003 miles. So this place is much more elevated than where we are standing right now. Or I guess sitting, if we want to be technical about that. Now the whole world had one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and break them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. We back up to that sentence and realize what we're saying in this verse. They are doing everything the opposite of what God commanded them, and that is intentional. They didn't say we're going to honor God here, we're going to honor ourselves. We're going to reach into the heavens. What would that do? In a tower that you have attempted to waterproof. Coming after the flood, they are trying to rebel against God's power by saying, well, you're not going to do that to us again. This event represents every type of rebellion they could think of to do at the time. And even I think when you look at the elevation, they could have done it in a higher area, and they may have, but we kind of have an idea where it is. But to the time, it would have looked to them like they're way above the waters now, especially people who hadn't actually lived through the flood. They were born after it. They think, we got this. Man's pretty arrogant sometimes. So, this is, they tell us this was likely a ziggurat tower, which goes very high. It builds these levels, kind of like you might see a multi-tier wedding cake. It's that same effect as what they're doing with that. The broad base lets you build it higher and higher and higher. So it's very deliberate what they're doing. This is a place of idolatry. There would be a temple built into here. They would have sacrifices. This is centralized, not filling the earth. And the way I put it is, this represents spiritual warfare. So this is what's going on in Babylon. And who's doing it? It's the descendants of Ham. That's worth noting. It's not the Canaanites themselves, but they are related. Okay, so modern day, you'd have Baghdad in Iraq here, and Babylon is a little south of there, 56 miles approximately from Baghdad. This is an excavation site that they will tell you is definitely, maybe, could be the site of the Tower of Babel. That is actually what that place looks like today. And as far as modern knowledge and ability to study these things go, it's the most likely location we have. That's what it looks like.
Are we talking Babylon the country or Babylon the city?
City. But it would be, this would be where Babylon the Empire was.
The city? Or
That would be the capital of Babylon the city. The capital of the empire would be Babylon the city.
Because on one of the maps you had before, it had Babylon up here and it had Babylon down here.
Yeah, there's...
It was one of the first ones.
Okay. Okay, yeah, this one has a northern one. And that's entirely possible, especially because there's reasons you might have different capitals. If you're the king, you might want to winter in the south, for example. So it wouldn't be uncommon for them to have two capital cities. And again, I'll say everything is best guess, so it wouldn't shock me if I put up maps that conflict with each other on an exact location.
You're talking about Babylon as the empire.
Yeah.
It's not the Roman Empire. I mean, it spanned a lot of area.
Yeah.
It's like the Assyrian Empire, all those that they took over the whole area.
Oh, yeah. Rome, Babylon, starting with Assyria, these places get massive. When Nimrod is starting his empire here, this is very modest by our standards, but also the population of the world isn't nearly what it is now. So it was pretty impressive for back then. But his army may not have even measured in the hundreds. He might have been running around with 12 guys, for all we know. Probably a little more than that. Okay. So that's Babel. Anything else we want to say about that? Okay. We're going to jump ahead to Abraham. Of course, the end of the story with Babylon is God forcibly scatters them, changes the language, and they're forced to spread out. They don't get a choice in the matter anymore, is what they found out. But we're going to go ahead to Abraham. We're picking up in Genesis 12, verse 4 here. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. There's our first location for Abraham. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. And they departed from there to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Kind of amazing how much ground we just covered in that one sentence, isn't it? I mean, even without looking at it, you probably can already tell we just glossed over how far this journey was. Abram passed through the land of the place of Shechem as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were there in the land. Okay, so where did Abram come from? This was a study as of 2016. This is an excavated site that's one of the possible locations. It is known as Kasdim or Tel El Maquire. As I understand it, the word tel is something to the equivalent of mound, and it's just an excavation site. So in a lot of these, anytime they're talking in a scholarly sense about these locations and excavations going on, they'll use the word tel and then the name of the place. So it tells you it's an excavation site, and then the name of the place is El Maquire. Fun fact about this is this was a formerly coastal city, and the land has shifted. Again, 4,000 years is a long time for the geography of an area and location to change. And people follow water. So it makes sense that originally you would build the city near water, and then as it happens, things have shifted, and then people moved away from that city because there was no longer the water. The water was over there. So we moved over to where the water was. The city became abandoned. And this is known for the ziggurat of Ur. That's just a thing that exists. It's an archaeological find. So it has some notoriety for that. So where did Abraham come from? Over here. So we're in the area of Babylonia. This is the Persian Gulf. And Ur would have been a coastal city. It would have been near the mouth of a river, heading out into the Persian Sea. And Abraham is going to travel a long way up to Haran. That's already a big journey, but that's not even his final destination. He's going to come from Haran down into the land of Canaan here. That is a lot of traveling by foot, possibly by camel. It wouldn't shock me if they had camels. They wouldn't have had horses. Horses aren't really a thing for another 2,000 years at this point. That's when they'll start being used in warfare. It's one of the powers of the Assyrian Empire. They'll use a lot of horses. But you don't have horses really mentioned in the Bible, I don't think, until Judges, probably. Judges, if not King Solomon. One or the other. But that's how far you're talking until we really have horses. Okay. So Genesis 12 tells us that Abraham went from Ur to the Promised Land. For general purposes, I'm probably going to call it that because it's the land that was promised to Abraham, and that just works regardless of what time era you're talking about. So whenever I use that language, I'm talking about what was promised to Abraham. And then he will have an additional trip that he goes to Egypt because of famine. And that may sound familiar because it tends to happen in this part of Genesis. We keep having famine and looking to Egypt for food. Egypt, with its river system, this was a very fertile area, produced a lot of grain. Even to the Roman Empire would be exporting grain and taking it all the way back to Rome. Since we already brought the Romans into this, why not? All right. So let's talk about this famine briefly. Genesis 12, verses 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. So it was when Abram came to Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, this of course being his wife Sarai, and that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house, and he treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. Sheep are the big one. Sheep is what the family is going to primarily have. And we see that more when we get down to Joseph. They've got lots of sheep. Of course, when you get down to King David, what was he? Shepherd. Sheep are a very big deal. There's also, I won't say this is every time you see it, but there's a common practice you'll see in the Bible where they list the most important thing first. So we may have heard the saying, save the best for last. Well, if you think about it in those terms, sheep, with the history we know they have, was probably the most important thing on this list. Fun fact. Throwing it in for no extra charge. So Egypt, where was he? This was a complicated time in Egyptian history, and Egyptian history is complicated to begin with. A possible site is Zone or Tanis. This was researched by Napoleon. Napoleon did a big expedition to Egypt, and it may have led, well, it did lead to something that you may have heard of. How many people have heard of the Rosetta Stone? Napoleon finds the Rosetta Stone on this expedition, and that is where we learned about Egyptian hieroglyphics from, because they had the 3 languages on the Rosetta Stone. Rosetta was the French name for the area that they found it in. And they found a bunch more since then, but we still all call them Rosetta Stones because that way we don't have to think of another name. And this was once the capital of Lower Egypt, which, just to be extra fun, is the north. Lower Egypt is the north because Egypt is relative to the River Nile. The upper Nile is what we call the south, and the lower Nile is what we call the north. And it's very common that there's fighting going on and there's splits between these two, and they're under different rule at the time, which probably plays a role in some of what we see later on. But again, try not to jump too much ahead. So when was Abraham here? I changed this later in further research. He's likely here during the intermediate period. I take that back. This is Abraham, not the Israelites. So he's probably here in the Middle Kingdom era. Upper and Lower Egypt, they could have been under different rule, and this was considered a golden age period for Egypt, which, when you think about it, makes sense, because if the rest of the area, geographically, when we're talking up into the Promised Land area, is having famine, and if you assume that's also going on in Sinai, then where's everybody buying their food from? Egypt. So where's all the money flowing? Egypt. Another tidbit of historical trivia is to realize that for most of human history, most of people's income was spent on food. So the most important thing you're going to buy, you have to have food, you have to have water to survive. That's where most of their money went. So in a period of famine, where's all the money going? To the person who's selling the food. And that was Egypt. So this would have been an extremely prosperous time for them. And the Pharaoh, the king of the land, is treating Abram with favor. God can use people, can't he? You have this Pharaoh who probably fancies himself a god, not a religious person, not a believer as we would know at all. But God can use that man to help Abram have prosperity. And I'm calling him Abram because he's still that, but I may call him Abram or Abraham and as we go. You all understand. It's easy to do. There's some historical footnotes here. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2560 BC. If you're ever curious, BC is before Christ's birth. BCE, what they mean when they say that is they're saying before the Common Era, which is just them trying to take God out of the timeline. But 0 is the Common Era, so what we're in is after the Common Era, BCE, whenever that pops up on a timeline that I stole, borrowed, researched. That's saying before Common Era. It's the exact same time frame. It's not a different scale. It's just them trying to call it something different. There is going to be, in this Middle Kingdom era, a group come in, and it's the Hyksos, which of course I'm probably mispronouncing them as well, but that's okay. I'm sure you'll all forgive me. That's a very significant event in Egyptian history. It's a pretty significant event for us with Bible history, and don't want to get too far into it, but when I say that Upper and Lower Egypt may have had divided rulership, this is part of why. You have this invasion of the north, and that may be who Abraham was dealing with. He may have been dealing with the Egyptians, and this came later. At this era in history, it's a little hard to pin things down exactly. But you'll get plenty of people who will tell you what their theory is. Okay, so where was Abraham? It's likely the Middle Kingdom era. He's in Lower Egypt. The capital is Heraclips, which is the red dot here. That's the capital. That's not necessarily where he is. And I put Cairo on here just for reference. That's modern day Cairo. The capital then would have been the red dot. Abraham would have come, of course, from here down into here. This land is called Goshen. We're going to talk about that later. And then, obviously, I'm not doing the stories in detail. We're glossing over the stories. We're just setting the context of which the stories happened in, and hopefully in that, learning to appreciate some of the background information a little more. So Pharaoh tries to marry Sarai. That doesn't work out too well for him, as you might remember. And so Pharaoh says, get out of here. And in Genesis 12, verse 20, Pharaoh will send Abraham and his family away. Verse 20, so Pharaoh commanded the men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Then Abraham went from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place which the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So this puts Abram from Egypt, and again, he may have been up here in Goshen, which is an area that's going to be much more significant later, and he comes up to Bethel, which is here west of the Jordan. The Jordan River, of course, being the river that they had. He's a little far away from it. which might be for a couple of reasons. One, it talks about him being rich in livestock. Well, if you have a bunch of animals, what do they need? Food. They've got to have something to graze on. So he wouldn't take a bunch of animals into a city that had nothing for them to graze on. He would have been in a plains area where there was grass and things that they could eat. So he probably went to an area without a lot of people in it. And I think that gets more apparent later on. So at Bethel, or the Negev, as it'll sometimes be referred to, Abraham is now back into the promised land. He went to Egypt for the famine. He was able to amass pretty good wealth there, and now he's back where he's supposed to be in the land that God has promised him. Then we get a division. Abraham and Lot both have a lot of stuff, and they said instead of having fights over stuff, let's split up. Abram gives the choice to Lot. You pick your way, I'll go the other way. And Lot chooses that he's going to go east. So in Bethel, Abram is probably not strictly at this one city, but he's probably in this entire region and moving around to graze the animals, because you'd want to give the grass a chance to grow back, go somewhere else where it's thick and plentiful, and move in kind of a cycle. That was very common practice until extremely recently in human history. You know, when I say that, just remember, 200 years versus 6,000 years is not 1%, and it's not a tenth of 1%. It is a very small fraction of time when we're talking about some of the things being ancient versus modern. So we have Abraham in the promised land, and Lot goes east in Genesis 13. This is what it looks like in modern times. Now, that doesn't look very friendly to animals. However, it's worth noting that when you look at this history longer and longer, there is a lot of warfare going on. And it probably did a lot of devastation to the land that hasn't had a chance to recover. So just because that's what it looks like now does not mean that's what Abraham saw at the time. And we talked earlier about how cities can change in just 40 years. How many more trees did you used to drive by than you drive by now? People build things. People divert rivers, change how water flows, and it changes the land drastically. But this is the general area where you're talking about Abraham traveling through as he's grazing his flocks. Lot goes to the east. He's moving towards what we now know as the Dead Sea. Keep in mind, that doesn't exist yet when we're talking about these things. When we're reading these things, the Dead Sea does not yet exist. Or at least not shape and scale as it does now. So as Lot is there, that's 5-minute warning, right? Okay. We're doing pretty good. As Lot is there, in Genesis 14, there's this side story where a king from the north comes down and he raids the Sodom and Gomorrah area. There's several cities affected by that, so he comes in and in the process is taking slaves, and that includes Lot, and Abraham is not going to have that. So, in Genesis 14, one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees in Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and the brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Now, when Abram heard that his brother had been taken captive, he armed his 318 trained soldiers. Again, population's not what it was, so army size is not what it is now. Born in his own house, and he went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, of course, when they say Dan, they're talking about that in terms the contemporary reader would have understood, because when the Jews are reading this, they know where Dan is. But it's not Dan yet, because Dan isn't even born yet. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is in the north of Damascus. So, what did Abraham do? Now, Bethel is south of Jerusalem, so here. Sodom and Gomorrah, you're talking somewhere around here. Damascus is all the way up here. This is a huge journey. This took a lot of effort for someone to come all the way down here to start a war over, and Abraham puts a tremendous amount of effort into chasing them all the way up to Damascus. Actually north of Damascus, but we don't know exactly where. But we do know where Damascus is, so it gives us a relative point at least. This area is Mount Quisan. It's not recognized as a site. Oh, okay. This is just generally what an area around here looks like. This is what north of Damascus looks like. I'm not telling you this is specifically where Abraham rescued Lot. I'm just saying you've got the terrain, you've got a lot of greenery, something like that. Obviously, they wouldn't have had the modern architecture. All right. I think we'll finish up with Melchizedek today. So Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into his hand." So this is where I'm going to wrap it up. So we had Abram starting up here in Damascus, and now he's come back towards where he lives in Bethel, but here in Jerusalem is likely where Melchizedek is from. There's a footnote that says Salem, and Salem being Jerusalem. So it's very likely where he was. He's a character who's mentioned several times in the Bible, but I think I'll save more on that for next week. So any thoughts so far on any of this? We moved around a lot. All right. Well, what I will say is I've got a few more weeks of this planned. Then Craig's going to take over. I guess I should specify Craig on my right. Craig on my left. I'm not dropping any surprises on you. If this is a series you enjoy and want to see more of, it's something I can come back to. And it is a long way to the churches of Asia Minor. And let's close with a prayer.